We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm the co-lead of the DataPride Tableau user group, and with Lawrence Durbin, who's waving hi. So, the mission of the DataPride LGBTQ user group is to highlight, elevate, and bring together the LGBTQ plus community in data and its allies. We'll go through a few announcements and then introduce our speaker. Bridget Cogley will be doing a talk on ethics by design. Then we'll have Q&A at the end and then wrap up after that. So interacting with others using the chat section works great. If you have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A icon in Zoom. It makes it easier to track questions and make sure that we can follow up at the end. We're recording this session, and we'll send out the recording and post it on YouTube afterwards. And we ask all attendees to be kind and respectful to each other and just enjoy our time together. So a few announcements since last time. We're now on Twitter. You can follow us at DataPride Tug to stay in touch with upcoming events. Thank you, Lawrence, for putting the links from this slide in the chat. So we're on Twitter at DataPride Tug. And you can keep up with all of our future events on Bevy, which is a new platform for all of the Tableau user groups. And to get started, you'll create a Bevy account for yourself and then subscribe to our group. And you would subscribe to whatever Tableau user groups you want to keep up with. Thank you, Brandy. Yeah, so you'll be seeing more of that this spring as all Tableau user groups make that transition to Bevy. As part of our mission to highlight and elevate the LGBTQ community, I wanted to share a couple of recent and upcoming events related to the community. Yesterday was International Women's Day. And International Women's Day is a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. And it's a day that marks a call to action for accelerating women's equality. If you want to do more with data related to International Women's Day and the mission, Back to Viz Basics, their Week 5 project is related to this. It's a data set about conveying a timeline. Data and diversity is another community project, and their March data sets have to do with women's history. And I also thought it was pretty neat that Kimberly Scott recently published a data viz on Moms Who Viz, which I thought was just an amazing project. So shout out to her, and shout out to International Women's Day. So that was yesterday, and coming up at the end of March is Transgender Day of Visibility. It's March 31st every year, and it's an international time to celebrate transgender and non-binary people around the world and acknowledge the courage it takes for them to live openly and authentically. And it's a time to help others learn more about the trans experience and combat hate and discrimination and misinformation. I wasn't aware of any related data vizzes or community projects on this, but if you know of any or have any ideas, we'd love for you to share them with us. And we just wanted to give a shout out to Transgender Day of Visibility to to celebrate and advocate trans people. All right. So our speaker today is Bridget Cogley, who will be giving a talk on ethics by design. Her Tableau journey started in 2010 when she was a part of a committee that selected Tableau as the organization's analytics tool. And she got more and more into it and moved into Tableau consulting full-time in 2014. She is the Chief Visualization Officer at Versalytics, and her role uplifts data viz within the organization and helps shape the vision. She's currently a Tableau Hall of Fame visionary and the co-author of Functional Aesthetics. And outside of work, she does martial arts, including Taekwondo, swords, and kickboxing, which I think is pretty cool. I hope you all enjoy this talk today. Bridget, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I will stop sharing my screen and give you the floor.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly introduce the topic. So this is ethics by design, and it's about building a comprehensive practice. A lot of times we hear ethics, it's an extraordinarily intimidating word. And so what this talk is trying to do is a few things. And so I'll walk you through the goals. And the first goal is really to understand ethics. What are they and why do we need them? The second is really about owning the message. It's, visualization itself is communication. And so when we speak, when we share information, we own that. It is ours. And the final is really a call to viz responsibly, and that recognizing that harm isn't necessarily just defined by me, but it's defined by others. And so really kind of keeping that in mind. And I'm going to go ahead and just give a call out to Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. This actually goes to Voltaire, but we've seen this many times with the Spider-Man comic. The motivation for this talk is twofold. So as Sarah kind of briefly mentioned, I, had this career trajectory and actually started with American Sign Language interpreting. So I was the person that would show up and go. And I would, primarily specialize in medical and a lot of other, post-secondary and things like that. I was RID certified for 9 years, which means that I had to adhere to a code of ethics. And if I didn't, I would not work again. And so, these sorts of things stick with you. I did a lot of education for hospitals around compliance, particularly in acquiring interpreters for both spoken and sign language. And then finally moved into this really weird role where I started analyzing data, and I found it really fun. The intersections between interpreting and analyzing really aren't that different. You're curious, you're really interested in what other people are doing, and you want to know why. And so I got to keep kind of doing that. And I always joke that I'm still interpreting, it's just now I'm interpreting data to insight. And so through that journey, I moved into some of the roles I'm doing now. In 2019, I had a bit of a pivot. I was still working, but I provided hospice to a dear friend of mine in Canada. And that was kind of a kicker. I mean, I've done hospice interpreting before. I actually have hospice training, but that, when you do something like that, you are away from home for several months, you really think about things. And so it took a couple of years, but then I actually co-founded my company with one of the people who showed me great empathy during that time. So when you go through a trialing experience, and people show you who they are, believe them. And when you remember that people do great things, keep them in your Rolodex or keep them in your phone. And that way, when they say, hey, I have a great business idea, they're good to go into business with. And so that brings me to my current role today at Versalytics. So that's part one, is that, I've had this weird career and ethics has been a part of my life. But the other part of this is that in 2020, we all had this great shock, every single one of us. It happened differently. And we'll dig into this. And, I am going to take you back to those very acute days. And so, back when COVID-19 really started spreading around the world, and we lived in this space of complete and total uncertainty. And by that, I mean FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Should we social distance? Do we stand 6 feet apart? I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had with people, and it's like, stay away. And we're, yelling at each other almost, the cross the street conversations. Were we masking? And I can remember, going out and buying my first cloth mask and going, okay, what do we do with this? Are we doing it? Which ones are better? We really didn't know in those early days. How contagious, we didn't know. Again, droplets, airborne, who knows? And then, who was most affected? Again, same thing. I had a child in school. It's very terrifying to send your child to school anyway. Let's be real. And then when we have an illness going on, it's even more terrifying. So this is kind of that talk. But what happened next after that is we had an epidemic. And particularly with the communities that I share where, you're analysts, we're curious, we want to know. And so, I did this analysis way back in September 2020. So I know that, in dog years, it's about 14 years ago, but it was really only 2. But I did this analysis and I just looked at, what happened? What were people talking about? And when you look at COVID or coronavirus visualizations on Tableau, this is kind of a sampling. Now, not all of these are case data. And what I'm most interested in for this talk and for this focus is case data. And so I did a method, again, using Alteryx, pulling down data at the time, and just look for sheets and dashboard descriptions with things like case, death, infection, morbid, so morbidity, growth, and spread. These were my key terms of, okay, are we, these are my clear-cut case visualizations. I'm sure I missed a whole bunch. I just wanted to be as precise as I could with my methodology. And I'm highlighting here that 143 visualizations, 143 unique workbooks were published on March 31st alone. Now, why I care about this is that, I was looking at this in September. This is when we were still deep in the heart of it. We were still going through waves. I don't even know if we had vaccination at that point. Again, I don't think we did. I think that was when it was still on the horizon. Again, COVID years, like dog years, they're very, very fuzzy. But I looked at these clear-cut visualizations, and I looked at the time that they were last updated. Tableau Public allows you to connect through Google and some other APIs and refresh your data. And so of these with refreshed data, only 12% had been updated within the last 7 days. So I want you to sit with this. We were trying to find information. We were putting information out in the public. And so I kind of termed this Ronavirus. And my biggest concern deals with visualizations made from case data in a crisis. Again, I want to go back to that very acute period in 2020 without appropriate expertise, guardrails for the users, ethical practices, which we will discuss here, clear directives in a crisis, commitment to regular updates while being published openly on the internet. When we publish things on the internet, that intersects with data journalism. And again, this is during a critical sense-making time. I want you to notice that verbiage because we will revisit that sense-making time. And so when we think about 2020, I know at this point, 3 years on, again, it gets very fuzzy, but at that time we were talking about circles, fill, what's more legible? Maybe red isn't a good choice. Maybe it's not culturally appropriate. Flatten the curve. Oh, this looks dire. Now it's just 6%, trending down. Cases make a great training set. We're all curious and this needs shared. You'll be fine. It's just old folks. What is a case? How do I calculate death rate? We're all affected by this in the same way. Maybe it's genetic. Why are some populations affected more than others? Trust me, I work in healthcare. And so when you see this discourse, we see a variety of things coming at us. And you can see where we're running into different clashes and collisions. Here's what went wrong. We forgot about the people affected by this data. So when we were having our discourse, we didn't really tie those back to humans. We chose not to include the domain experts. We failed to clarify essential terms. So what is a case? And so when you go back to those days, what truly got diagnosed as a case? Did you have to get a PCR test? If you had symptoms, were you counted in those totals? All of these different things. And then the final piece is that data viz had its moment. And I talk about in my book that when we talk about things like flatten the curve, this was the first not only data-driven pandemic, but where we sought our primary information from charts. I can't tell you the number of times I would hit Google and go, okay, here's where the chart is. Oh, cases are going up. There goes my weekly plans. Oh, cases are going down. Maybe I'll try for a picnic this week. You know, and a lot of us made decisions in this fashion. We consulted charts, and not just because we analysts like them, other people did too. Even my mother was going and checking these things out, going, okay, maybe. When we look at this and we hear things kind of bandied about like unethical, the logical question is, what are ethics? And we hear this term a lot, but it's not well defined. And so the best way to understand ethics is to define its outer boundaries. So when we look at morals and laws, these intersect with ethics. And in particular with this talk, we're looking at applied ethics, which will sit in the middle. Let's go to morals. This is probably one of the easiest ways to understand ethics. Morals are as close to us as our own skin. They are everything from what we believe, to what we say, to what we wear, to what we eat. And when you go through classical philosophy, the subject of normative ethics, so your virtue ethics, your duty ethics, a lot of your scholarly thought that is, historical, lives here. This is where we ask what makes a good person, what makes a good society. This is where we explore what is food actually? Do we eat these things or do we not eat these things? Can we have wheat meat or do we not? Are there certain animals that we do and don't eat? And this is a value assessment right here. You may or may not have a visceral response to this as that is not meat. And so taboos are morals in disguise. That is how we invoke them. And taboos are visceral. The other part of normative ethics, when we're talking about values and everything else, we start discussing the spectrum of rights. And you've likely heard this if you've done any work in philosophy at all, the spectrum of rights. And, if you do any studies in democracy, you hear the discussion around spectrum of rights come up. You hear things like good society. And ultimately, this part of morality is what funnels into laws. Now, laws are geopolitically confined. In the US, we have laws. In my home state, we have laws. In my local city, we have laws. And working at a company, I have rules which are not laws, but they may as well be the same thing because you can get fired for them. A lot of times companies make these codes of professional conduct, and I tell people that's not really ethics. That's just more rules, because a lot of the times that they're rolled out and implemented, they are actually rules. So I kind of lump them under the laws bucket. Laws are fun. We get told, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. And I'll kind of show you one where, when you think about curtailing rights, speed limits are one way. So I want you to take a quick look at this road. I'm going to zoom in on the speed limit. And what laws do is they say you have rights up to this point and you can go no further. Now, when I look at this road sign and it says 15 miles per hour and I drive a Subaru, I look at this and I go 15 miles per hour and those curves are calling to me and I could just. And a lot of us do this where we take a look at the law and go, I'm going to extend my rights here. And so that is a choice. Now, that is one example, potentially a bad example. But then what we need to do when we look at the domain of morals are also the domain of protest. So when you look at a law and you say the law is unjust, we look at laws around abortion access, transgender rights, the Don't Say Gay bills that are coming out right now. Protest. And that is a part of morals. So when a law is unjust, your morals activate and you say no. The other part of this, though, is we can look at classical philosophy and we can see where, from a moral standpoint, you are obligated to protest. And I really like this picture right here because it says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And that right there, folks, is ethics in a nutshell, because you cannot be neutral on a moving train. A lot of times, particularly in a professional side, we go, above my pay grade, can't do it. And guess what? You have chosen the side of the oppressor. And that is why ethics are so important. So protest is where we start delving towards actual applied ethics. So we've seen morals are personal. We've seen laws are geopolitical, and applied ethics sit in between. Because at the end of the day, applied ethics are generally something that we do on someone else's behalf. And particularly when we are looking at it from a professional lens. So yes, folks, data visualization counts. We often, as designers and creators, we look at this and say, hey, I'm just making a product. Like it's a thing, not an action. It's an action. So interpreting was very, very easy in this regard, because if I showed up and I did bad things, I could very, very clearly see the humans I hurt. When we do data visualization, it's very, very, very abstract. We are usually multiple layers removed from the humans. We often see the fuzzy numbers, and we don't realize the world we're creating. And so that is why we are here today. That is where ethics come into play. And we really, really have to think about what it is we do, which is really scary. And so when we think about ethics, we're really forced to ask a bunch of questions. We're forced to look inside ourselves and say, do I have the right? Again, scary question. We have to inspect our motivations and our perceptions and our biases. And then the final piece is, yes, we have to accept responsibility, the risk, and also the ownership. Again, absolutely terrifying, because yes, folks, you can also ethics yourself out of a job. When we look at ethics, what we're really looking at is the intersections of conflict. And so when you're doing ethics, you're really interested in where do things mash up against each other. Specifically, the conflict of values. Let's go back to our Ronaviz example. And so I'm taking you all the way back. We've seen this. There's a lot of noise. So what we're going to do is just drop out some of the noise. And we're going to just really look at the questions through an ethical lens. And we're going to see if we can start identifying the values, driving them. And when we look at these questions, they really are driven by fear. Specifically, the question of, should I be concerned? And if so, how much? And when we put this through an ethical value set, we can see that what we're really saying is, I need to be able to make decisions. I want to be safe, and I trust my skill set. Now, when we translate those three values into the values that are typically codified in codes of ethics, and when you really look at these codes of ethics over time, there's about maybe 10 values that effectively come up, and really only 8. These three are what we're really talking about right this second. One is autonomy. I need to decide. The other is sanctity of life. I would like to live. And trust. I trust my skill set. And we can really see this when we look at kind of before and after. So here's a snapshot of everything before March 9th. And you can see the locations where we had lockdowns, and you can see kind of where things were starting to shut down. So this is March 8th. Now, on just one day later, we tip over, and by the 22nd, so 2 weeks apart, we can see where lockdowns have just massively spread. And the amount of visualizations have significantly increased. And I just want to put these side by side for a moment. And so we can see this information seeking behavior, where as soon as it starts hitting in certain areas, there are cultural values driving this, where I'm going to visualize this, I'm going to understand this. So that's part one. And so the other part of this with this infodemic is there's a few things. There's, I feel important. There's so many hits daily. I can impress my peers. For once, this is important. And it really, really was. Doing my part. Otherwise I feel helpless. Math makes sense. There's that comfort seeking right there. This is logical. All this other stuff over here is emotional, and it's not logical, and it's really, really scary and ambiguous. This affects others, not me, so I'm removed. And it's because, put in an explanation here. So these are all the ways that we kind of shove accountability off. Well, it's, I need this for this reason. That's why when you do ethics, motivation comes up and it's so critical to what we do. When I do interpreting, there's actually rules about what I can and can't volunteer for. If I just go with my friend to their appointment, I'm actually doing them a disservice because they're not getting the interpreting they need. And so when you're very familiar with kind of ethics and volunteering, this makes sense. When you're outside of it and you're like, that just seems like it's hurting. It's like, no, because they need to have a qualified interpreter. Nobody knows if I'm qualified or not. I did my many years of interpreting before being qualified without being qualified. So these are things to keep in mind. Again, I want to go back to this shark fin because you can really see where the interest waned quickly. Again, that's that motivation piece. And so now we start adding more values conflicts to this. We start seeing where are we doing harm by not updating this, by putting these visualizations out there and abandoning them? Are we being just? Are we being fair? When we look at the language used on some of these, we'll definitely see where we were not being just or fair and where we were doing harm. Now, I've shown you these values a few times, and I had mentioned there's about 8 of them that we really kind of standardize on in these codes of ethics. And where these values come from are we look at a profession, you distill it down to values. And what's really, really neat when you study these codes of ethics, and I have, is that you see a common theme, and these are the ones that come up. Sanctity of life, do no harm, trust, autonomy, justice and fairness, privacy, respect of property. Let's dig into these. Probably one of the hardest ones to really understand, and it comes with a very hard name, is beneficence. It is the classic do no harm. Because a lot of times, and I have other presentations where I've referenced Frankenstein because that is the best demonstration of ethics you can find in a fiction novel. Because what it does is you look at the optimism around your creation and you see where it goes awry. So oftentimes when we are creating things, we see the benefit, we really struggle to see the harm. And so we have to ask ourselves, who does this data help? How? Not if, how? Can somebody get hurt by this data? What guardrails do we need to put in or clarify? What information are we missing or assuming? I'm going to have these book recommendations throughout here. And again, I'm happy to put this into an email list. I owe it to other people as well. My must-read book, and I actually have it right here with me, is by Dr. Brandeis Marshall, and that's Data Conscience. And I will strongly encourage you to get that book. When we start moving to autonomy, we are looking at supporting self-determination. I don't like when people make decisions for me. I'm sure a lot of you don't either. And so what we're trying to do is support self-determination. When I go to my doctor's office, I want to be in charge of my care, even if I'm not 100% versed in everything. I'm relying on their professional expertise, but at the end of the day, I need to make that decision. When we look at data, do the people represented in this data have control over how it's collected? What story is told in dispute mechanisms? When I get in my car and my phone connects off to whatever it does, it is really hard to get it to not track my location at every minute of the time. Who has control over what the information is stored and what story is crafted? Can people opt out and still use the service? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. Think about that. And then, is data the only currency used for the service? Again, must read here is Weapons of Mass Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. When we get into privacy, this is one where I think culturally, Americans in particular kind of just went, don't care anymore. And I've seen this. I mean, we're really struggling to pull it back a bit with things like GDPR and other things where it's like, let's at least, limit this, not have as much surveillance technology. So are we collecting and keeping only what we need? Am I protecting what I have? I know for me, I get emails, it seems like daily from, oh, this person, our information got hacked or leaked out. Am I disclosing my collection process? Google is notorious for this. Yes, you've got your location turned off. Is it even possible to opt out? I've got a Google alert here because there's a concept called data sovereignty. Dr. Desi Small Rodriguez is one of the pioneers in this area where she's writing and discussing it and really sharing a lot of information around it. She has a chapter in a book. I strongly encourage you to go check that out. Respect of property. So this is that do not steal. And particularly with our role, we live in a really weird spot because we're handed data all the time. Data we don't own. But, and so we really have to start asking, who does own this data? And are appropriate credits given? Can we trace the lineage of this data? Where in the world did it come from? And I've got two things here. I've got a Google alert for Dr. Crystal Sosi, who is part of the Data Leadership Collaborative, and she's written there. She does wonderful work around bioinformatics, and she does so from an Indigenous perspective. Strongly encourage you to go check out her work. The must read I have here, if you're looking and saying, well, that's not a data book, that is because it is the perfect model for where we are today. It's the story of Henrietta Lacks, and you may or may not know that story, but once you read it, it will haunt you. And I love to leave things lingering in heads, so you can see that that's my cruelty there for today. Strongly encourage you to check that book out because we are at that moment right now with data. Confidentiality, be trustworthy. Do I share this information in a trusted fashion with only those who need it? A lot of laws are designed around just this fact, HIPAA, FERPA, we can name out the acronyms here, but a lot of laws deal with how do we limit the sharing of information. When, do I anonymize appropriately when I'm sharing publicly? There are cases where when you share information, people can totally, very easily de-anonymize that data. Are the relationships I'm drawing and creating truthful? Are people drawing conclusions from my work that just aren't true? And then are we disclosing information we shouldn't? I've got my must read here is Data Feminism. I guarantee you a good chunk of people here have it, but I also know there's a lot of people who don't. Get this book. I really appreciate what the authors did because they actually crowdsourced. They wrote the book publicly and they really iterated. And I mean, I'm blown away by the effort that went into this book. They also inspired a lot of trust because they had some goals around equity. And they were very transparent about, well, we failed here, we achieved here, we overachieved here. This book is an amazing model to me. The final one, and to me, this one is, we're going to spend some time here because this is our #1 struggle right now. And that is around justice and fairness. Not just being trustworthy, but being fair. Am I making undue, wrong, or biased connections in my data? Am I excluding information to support a particular finding or goal? Are my records true and traceable back to their sources? Is this data biased? Obviously it is, so how? How was it collected? With the use of predictive, are we guilty before innocent? Really sit with that one. My must read here is Ruha Benjamin, and she's got Race After Technology as one book, but she has so much work out there. You would definitely benefit from going out and reading all of it. The bonus here is if you have masterclass, Cornell West has a beautiful philosophy course. I strongly encourage you to go and watch that. He is an activist philosopher. He goes out, he protests, he does a lot of work. I really, really appreciate the perspectives he brings. So with these values, I want to highlight the real goal of applied ethics. And that is to think beyond ourselves. That is really looking at how do we include other people as professionals. So I'm a data professional. How do I include them in decision-making? And so classical virtue ethics typically focused on creating a good society. So when you read a lot of the classical philosophical works, you see a lot of the word good. When you look at modern philosophers, and you look at some of, people from the 60s and everything else, and a lot of kind of newer people coming on the scene, you see a lot more questions around how do we create a just society? And those distinctions are extraordinarily important. If you've watched The Good Place, you've seen those ethics in action. That comes from T.M. Scanlon, and he's done a lot of work around justice and that sort of thing. Same thing with Cornell West. And so when we think about launching from justice, I want to revisit those conflicts once more. And so one question that happens is what happens when rights overlap? And oftentimes when you think about, in school and other things, the narrative is, here's me, here's others, and we kind of take turns. Sometimes, I get more rights, sometimes, they get more rights, and we toggle back and forth. That is the, quote unquote, classical teaching. And it's this give and take. Now, what I really want to show you is what happens in reality. And definitely, I know, members with kind of ties with this group can definitely speak to this as well, where you've got privilege, you've got more affected, and you've got others, and you see this suppression of rights. And we're really, really seeing it now. We are actually seeing in democracy a decline. We are seeing kind of a recession of democracy. And so this is extraordinarily important right now, because what's being happened is you've got these groups where you're being sold that you've got rights, but then you're seeing that those rights recede because of the ordering of how people are privileged and not privileged. And what ends up happening is you've got rights that end up going to the privileged group. And so this is really, really important, is recognizing kind of that gaslighting zone. It's the you have rights, but you don't. And this is one. And so this is where I kind of tell people I've got James Baldwin quotes for days, because we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. When I looked at RonaViz, and when I look at other things today, I see a lot of this, where, when we think about revisiting this responsibly in some of those calls, and we go back to those discussions, and we think about March 9th, literally 3 years ago today, this, we had the flatten the curve graphic. And so this was everywhere in a number of different permutations where it's like, oh, it's just the cold. Oh, it's not so bad, whatever. You can see this. And that's what happens to the healthcare output. And then it's like, no, if we really, take precautions and do these things, we can flatten the curve. So this is one graphic, and this is now part of our collective memory. So, this is in my book. I discussed just how flatten the curve really became kind of a part of that story. So there's other parts to this, though, and I had talked about sense making before. Kate Starbird is a disinformation scientist. That is her whole job. She does all of this research into how disinformation happens. And so one of the things that she tweeted about at one point, and you're going to see a lot of these like March 7th and March 9th dates. She replies, though a natural response to crises, sense-making can produce rumors, including ones that turn out to be true and ones that turn out to be false. The latter, i.e. misinformation, are dangerous because that can cause people to take actions that endanger themselves or others. So timing matters. And then Kareem Carr mentioned, and this really landed with me because of interpreting and because of my experience with practice professions. You're always told, be very cautious, like let this person go first. And so he says, actual epidemiologists. Sure, we know a lot about the diseases, but let's be responsible by deferring to the best experts. Random tech, Twitter nerds, we literally know nothing about epidemiology. Let's randomly plot stuff and extrapolate like we've never heard of science. And so as chart makers, as people who do this for a living, our opinions hold weight. And so we have a responsibility and an accountability. Jorge Camo had mentioned this, and this is to me a discussion point because I don't know that it's happened yet. He had said, I suspect the data viz communities will need to go soul searching after this is over. I know I'm trying to have these conversations. I don't know that we're wholly having them. And maybe it's too soon still. Amanda McCulloch came in. She is a key part of the Viz Responsibly movement. She also, when you mirror her comments in line with what Kate Starbird said, I appreciate those who've taken time to curate and collate their thoughts and recommendations. But this is maybe an instance where Viz can do more harm than good by misleading or confusing, particularly when there is uncertainty in the data. Got to put my own tweet in there. And so I put out there, okay, I've kept quiet most of the day. Okay, not really. I have a long list of people I don't want to catch this current virus. Frankly, I'm tired of losing people, and this virus could very easily create both long and short-term problems for many I care about. If you want to be cavalier about death, come visit. I can tell you exactly what death and dying looks like. Do not become numb to these numbers. You have great power in your hands. Wash them, yes, but think about what you type. That too spreads. I am not numb. I may have been tense because it was also the first year of Kelly's birthday. So this is actually Kelly's birthday today. And so fresh grief that year. And then this one really stands out to me, both for the ableism that is pointed out, but also the value sets. And so what we have here is finally, stop reassuring people with, you're probably fine unless you're elderly or chronically ill. Says a lot about our society that we keep using this to reassure ourselves. For what it's worth, I'm not writing this in response to any particular viz. I'm writing this as a high-risk person. A lot of the vizzes I'm seeing feel dismissive of COVID and or me, or like they're announcing my impending doom. Our work impacts people. And so with this timeline, I want to kind of pivot now to how has COVID affected you? And, I initially showed this timeline like this when I first started this talk. And in review now, maybe it's like this. I don't know. Maybe this is more of a realistic milestone, but maybe it's not. But I want to ask you, how many of these kind of milestones in your COVID timeline are deaths? I can definitely go through and point out dots in mine. But then what we saw was the drastic disparity between various populations. And so this was, not even 3 months apart from that, massive impact. And so we saw almost 1/3 of Black Americans know someone who have died from COVID-19. Again, this is still extraordinarily early on. The results are only more damning now, significantly so. And I did a lot of survey analysis during COVID. And one of the things I kept seeing as a quote, and I kept seeing this even in the news, is we may all be weathering the same storm, but we are not all in the same boat. And I can't tell you the number of times I saw this quote in particular in a lot of that survey data. And so now as I look back on this, and so it's been years now, and we've all kind of settled into various different places. And for me, when I look at this was the first data literate pandemic. The charts drove the story. We really lived and kind of checked them and made a lot of decisions on them. And other people did too. It wasn't just the data people. It was everybody. It was the news. It was bleeding parts of headlines. And so these charts were everywhere. We failed so many ethical tenets in some of these early visits just through the values and how we phrase things and kind of how we deployed them. We, we'll explore some of that, but the final piece of this, and I've said this numerous times, numerous years, this is not a call unique to COVID, but this is a call because we continue to bump up against it, is that we absolutely must shift our mindset from technicians, they're the boss, they do it, customer is always right, to practice professionals where we have a code of ethics. And it's an absolute must. And when I say technicians, I'm defining this as hands that do. I'm just making charts. I'm just doing this thing. I'm on the keyboard making these things. I'm very focused on my part. I'm not going to go and check the backend data. I'm not going to, force too much on them. I'm not going to go, ask about inputs. I'm just focused on my piece. Our conclusions end up being very limited and descriptive. Quite frankly, not anymore. I know way back in the dark ages when I was working in Excel, I could truly fairly say that, but those days are gone. And, historically, we were limited by the data. We couldn't actually get the data at the granularity we're getting it at today. It came in these little pieces and parts and was highly aggregated. And so we had a very minor influence because we were doing a lot of extrapolation work. And the other part of this, when we were doing this before, is we trusted people could come up to speed. They could catch up to our knowledge pretty quickly. Those days are so gone. And so we absolutely have to transition to this practice professional model. We have to really acknowledge that we are minds that think. It's not the hands that are doing the work, it's the mind. We are action and influence focused. We so often talk about when it's good, all the impact data viz can do. We really try to shield when we realize that it's bad. And our conclusions can affect reality and have a significant impact on them. I've done work, I've checked in, and 12, 13 years after the fact, those things are still deployed. And so I've had, work not only outlast me at a job, but outlast, me where I've moved to several jobs. So, the only thing that really limits me, so the conclusions affect reality, but the only thing that really limits me is me. Very scary. So it's me and others. That's it. It's not the data. It's no longer a physical limitation. It's a moral one. And so we have massive and longitudinal influence. And it's really, really hard to explain our work to people. It's really hard to catch them up now. And so people can't catch up anymore, not like they used to. It's a lot harder to make the leap. And that is why we are practice professionals and why we must create an ethical practice. And so I want to dig into decision making. And so typically when we make decisions, hey, I want to go out, hey, I want to go do these things, we'll often make decisions on kind of this index of good and bad. I like it, I don't like it. And this is a core part of applied ethics. Applied ethics is all about this decision-making process. How do humans make decisions? And so typically what we do, we banter back and forth. We say, hey, it's more good than bad. I'm going to do it. Maybe it's flipping the coin. These are all the ways we make decisions. When there's two of us, we may sit here, we may negotiate, we may talk about it, we may argue, we may kind of pull each other, and then we finally end up with a decision. Hey, we both say it's more good than bad. One person very clearly thinks, way more good. Other person, maybe. And so that's joint decision making. But this is not how we make decisions as professionals. When we make decisions as professionals, we've got to turn the axis. We've really got to give the priority to somebody else. And we have to put ourselves in the background, which is really hard. And so we make this scatter plot of sorts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what? We recognize we've kind of got, our matrix here. We're going to say, when people think these things are kind of good or bad, and we're in agreement, these are the zones of agreement. We tend not to run into ethical issues here because we're in agreement. It's easy. You're not running into those conflicts as much. Where we run into problems is when they think something is good and we think it's bad. There's risk of denying it. There's risk of being like, oh, no, it's not as good as you think. There's also the risk of dismissal, where I support something and they don't. And you see who gets the bigger thumbs, by the way. And so these are ways that we start making decisions. So we'll revisit this decision matrix a few different ways, because when we start making decisions, what we're going to do is start plotting things. We're really good at this. And so let's see what this actually looks like. So I want to take an example of a personal visualization. And so I want to highlight, some of the decisions that we would make. And so, this person said, I want to make a personal viz. It's local. I'm going to update the data. And here's some of the other things I'm going to do. We both all agree that mixed messaging is bad. So we're going to be very clear. Now, there could be some comfort seeking with the data. So we've got to be aware of that. What may be comforting to you may be very distressing to somebody else. And so we have to keep that in our mind. The other thing we have to keep in our mind is things like the fatality rate, particularly in an active pandemic when there is high risk of distress to other people. So I'm going to highlight a personal viz that somebody did. So this is from Kevin Flerlodge, and he did this viz. Initially, it was, I have COVID. Then he changed it to I had COVID once it passed. And I want to highlight some of the aspects of this. So he writes, yeah, it's correct. I got COVID. And he walks through, being a data viz junkie, I decided to do this viz. And, he stopped tracking at a certain point, but he's really clear about the story. And the other thing he did is he says, designed by me, using a list of symptoms from the CDC and populated with my own data and experience. So he's very, very clear about collection methods. So when we plot this, we can think about, okay, well, we're humanizing data. It's a personal viz. We've got updated data. Okay, we have some privacy concerns, right? I mean, health information, HIPAA. But when you're releasing your own information, you've got a lot more freedom. It's his data and narrative. When we think about misinterpretation, We see the text layer that he's provided. And so I had to ask him about this. I saw this, I was like, tell me the story. And he said, in general, my decision to share was the fact I'd not seen a single viz from the viewpoint of a person who actually had it. Everything was aggregated to county, state, country, the world. It was all a bunch of numbers. There was no data humanism element. So I decided to release it to bring awareness, to show people it was for real, and to show people it sucks. And so, this is a tool. I definitely invite you to use it. And we'll see a couple more examples of it as well. So don't feel like this is the only time you're going to see it. I'll go ahead and talk about some of the other things that we can do to really bring ethics to the forefront. And one of the key things is recognizing that most data ties back to people. And there is a lot of research and study into how we treat us versus them. Robert Sapolsky is leading in this area. And so how do we bring them to the front of the mind? And the easiest way is to think about us, to humanize the numbers and bring people back in. And so I've got a couple of examples here. I also want to highlight a couple of things as I do this. So this is the idea of, by, and for. And so we can really see the value of being from a community and how that affects the language use and the perspectives and the way we look at data. I'm going to jump to this other example. So this is from Kate. Kate is a cancer survivor. She is very open about it. So I'm not telling you information I shouldn't. But when Makeover Monday did a cancer survival data set, this is what she did. And I thought it was the most profound viz I'd ever seen, at least with this data set, for one reason. She says, you are not a statistic. 31%. A woman diagnosed with cervical cancer will read that the 5-year survival rate is 69%. What she will see is that 31% don't make it in 5 years. 5-year survival estimates don't tell the full story. Top-tier doctors understand your diagnosis and your treatment plans. You are not a statistic. Only somebody with firsthand experience would realize what people see. And so particularly with this group, when you think about your perspectives, when you think about the narratives that are out there, and when you do a viz, know the power you're bringing, know the services you're doing for others like you. You have extraordinary power. And so I encourage you to use it. Sarah had talked about Transgender Awareness Day on the 31st. If that is your experience, you have a lot of light to share, particularly right now. And so I strongly encourage you, feel free to put yourself out there and share that story. And don't let others tell you that you're bringing in too much of yourself. So a lot of times when we have firsthand experience, we're often told, don't share it, don't, that's not neutral. And when you think about Ida B. Wells, and you think about, W.E.B. Du Bois, and those kind of stories that got shared, the superpower was being part of the group. So don't dismiss your experience. One other part of this is bias checking. And I really like this example. This is another Joshua Smith example. And so you can see where he writes hover for bias acknowledgements. I'm actually seeing more of these where people are finally saying, you know what, I'm going to just let you know that I have a bias. I have a stake in this. And just by doing that, by being aware that we have a stake in this is really, really important. And I will again say, particularly right now. And data journalism is also going through this. We're seeing this right now with how transgender people are being covered, how we're seeing this with Don't Say Gay bills, where people are having their perspectives squelched. And so it's really, really important to bring this to the forefront, especially right now. One final piece, and I want to show you this, and then we'll jump to some more things, but is the idea of repairs. So when you put something out there and then later you realize, maybe I did something wrong, or people come to you and say, there's some problems here. You can do repairs. You can say, you know what, I will listen to you. I will take your perspective. And so Ken did this amazing viz for, social distancing planning, but his initial viz had, red, but then blue. And a few of us said, blue kind of gives us an idea that maybe things are okay and maybe they're not. And so when we talked to him, he said, you know what, this is great feedback. And so, this is a part of where he said, you know what, I'm going to put in these caveats, I'm going to change the colors. And he really made it clear, like, this is only a part of the equation. There's more to consider. And I really, really appreciated that he took that feedback. And so when we look at a decision matrix using this data and using this, we're using data for reopening. Good. Validated technique. Now we saw some, potential misinterpretation. And so we put a warning. And then when we look at potential ramifications, we had that ethical discussion and warning, like, this is not the whole picture. There are other things to consider. When we looked at the initial color usage and kind of evaluated that maybe they're showing some things that they shouldn't, we went ahead and had, changed those colors. And so this is an extraordinarily powerful example of how you can do a repair. And so, with ethics, you will do repairs often. You will. We all make mistakes. I've had things where it's like, I've looked at it, a year or two later and said, it's coming down. And so these are important decisions to make. You will not always make the right choice. I fail often. Another tool set that we can use is this values kind of tool. And I really like this one because it helps understand what's going on. You can use it cross-culturally, you can use it, across time periods. I had a conversation yesterday just with somebody and they're like, well, my background is from this country and I don't understand why. And we had a whole conversation about values. And so, it's really important to understand where standard values fall at a given moment. So when you think about American culture, autonomy is very high in American culture. We like to be independent. We like to make our own choices. Privacy may be lower because of things like social media and everything else, and you think about other pieces to this and where these values typically distribute. In times of a pandemic, though, we saw this radical shift in values where we said, sanctity of life has to go up. Doing no harm has to go up. Trust has to go up. Autonomy goes way down. And justice and fairness has to go up. Privacy goes even further down. Some of the property goes a little bit further down. And so you can see these shifts in value sets. Klaus did this really neat viz, and I liked it because of a lot of things. Number one, he really took into account the values at the time. And so I want to highlight just the benchmarking that occurred. He kind of took a look at, okay, here's conventional values, here's urgent pandemic values. I'm not going to make a thing that affects these urgent pandemic values. I'm going to be really, really focused. So he did a retrospective. He limited it. He narrated the entire thing. So it's very heavily narrated. He's got tons of references. He has calls to action. All great things. But how these play out against the value is that's why he did it. He looked at, okay, we've got these pandemic value sets going on. I'm going to limit it. I'm not going to make this tool that looks forever and ever where people are going to try to predict their risk. I'm limiting it to a small area, and I'm narrating it and having lots of references and finally including a call to action. The other tool, and I use this tool and I've used this tool for a number of years, but I really like this book because it intersects with this tool a lot. And so that is Dr. Brandeis Marshall's book. And so you think about the inputs, how do we take in data? You think about the form and the way we collect data, because it really affects how we can do the analysis. Race is one common example. Gender is another common example. When you limit people's choices and they can't truly describe who they are, you're really not getting good data. And the other question is, do you even really need that data? So think about your inputs and the type of data that you're getting. With storage, we can kind of think through, is it stored in JSON? Can I make these relationships I think I'm making, or can I not? Looking at modeling and prep and the way we shape the data, and then defining it and analyzing it. What are we filtering? What are we doing with the data? And then finally, the output, which is the visualization itself. And so data literacy is an ethics issue. When you cannot access or navigate the full spectrum of this, you are missing access. You are not able to truly gain the insight that's there and are dependent on what you're given. When we talk about data literacy, it's a lot more like healthcare literacy. If I break my arm, I need to know where to go. Do I go to the urgent care? Do I go to the ER? Where am I going to get care? If I get the flu, am I going to go to the urgent care or the ER? That is healthcare literacy. I don't have to necessarily know everything about the medical condition. I need to know where to go. Our users are very much the same way. And so we have to relentlessly question the inputs. I'm going to show you an example from Expedia.
So Bridget, real quick, the book that you referenced, what was the name of the book that you referenced during the previous slide? Just real quick.
Yes, this was indeed the same book. So yes.
Data Conscience. Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I am happy to work with whomever to put together the email as well of like, these are all the book references. So when we look at this reopening example, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And you can see just the different facets of data that they're pulling in. I'm going to zoom in one more time and really let you see what they're covering. And so you can see that they're explaining here, it's the data facet. Here's, what it is. So it's policy responses. Here's where it came from. And then here's the really cool part is that they constantly are disclosing their methods. So when I look at this tool from Expedia, I've got this map, I've got kind of this information. And when I zoom into the stringency and the methodology they talk about, here's what the stringency index is. And it's, here's the 9 responses that it's tracking. It's everything from school closures to workplace, public info campaigns. All of these are covered here. And then the other beauty is we're getting update data. So we're very clear about when this data has been refreshed and what we're comparing it to. So here's recovering countries, here's the index versus 7 days ago. And so there's a lot of transparency. And you've kind of heard me kind of briefly talk about, ethics checking or Franken-proofing your work. So again, when we think about the novel Frankenstein, we're very optimistic about our creations. Why wouldn't we be? We're excited, we're happy, we know, what we do, but we have to vet ourselves because we're always going to be optimistic about the things we make. They will take on a life of their own and other people will not experience the same thing we do. You'll see I have a guide here for ethicalos.com. And I really love that tool set because it really walks you through a lot of facets. It's got check boxes and you can say yes or no, I did or considered the thing. You're going to see a lot of times with ethics, we're going to spend a lot of time asking questions. And so when we think about how to design ethically, using models will help you a lot. These are things like the decision matrix that you saw, the value assessment, evaluating it against the data literacy cycle. You can see some of these toolkits in action where we can really kind of explore everything through it. And sometimes I use all 3. So don't feel like you got to pick one. A lot of times it's like, and it's like, okay, I'm going to try this one. Okay, this helps me a little bit. What are the values? Values really not a big deal. Oh, there's a lot to consider on this data literacy circle. The other part of this with using the models is, that will get you so far. But the other thing you absolutely must do is have empathy and test it with other people because there is no way one human can know every experience. You will screw up. And that's where you depend on kind of a council of people to keep you accountable. So you shop it with other people because even if we share similar facets, we don't all have the same experience. The final part of this is you will make mistakes. You will do this thing, you think it's great, you've vetted it with people, you've done all the tools and everything. And even still, somebody's like, did you know? Did you consider? And you're gonna be like, got me, let me go fix this. And that's not a bad thing. That is a key part of ethics is repair. Now, my marketing team says I need to do this. So here's a book I wrote that's completely on a different topic, but every now and then I mention ethics. You should buy this book. That is my marketing department. Check the box. And now I'm going to open it up to questions.
Awesome. So if you have any questions, post them in the chat, post them in the QA. There's nothing at the moment. I do have to say there's some tie-ins with for the gaslighting portion. and how you were talking about, the privilege, the other, and those who are affected and afflicted, brought me into thinking around Crenshaw and exactly, and intersectionality, and talking about
Yes.
those different things of like, you've got the privilege and people have, you have those areas, but then there's the multiple oppressive identities that is their intersectional identities. And so it made me think of that and everything there. And then
And this is
also,
situationally defined. I mean, you can be
mhm,
in one group in one situation and then move to another group in another situation.
correct. And that's for me, I always put up the wheel of power because I
Yeah.
am white, cisgendered, and male. So, there's the privilege there. And then I also I'm LGBTQ, I am neurodivergent. There are so many other things, but my privilege typically takes the center stage in that, no matter what. But a lot of people don't have that. And it's more the multiple oppressive for them. And then on top with that, when you're going through the data literacy and ethics and talking about the experiences and getting the feedback and sharing things that are your perspective, makes ethically going and reaching out to the people. If you're doing data on people, get their context, get their input. The wider, the wisdom of crowds, the wider the experiences and all that, the better the solution. So keeps thinking me into that is going through this, get their input, because you're going to have your bias, and being upfront with you weren't in that, you have your bias from just looking at it, and then bringing in these people is huge. So I'm like, the fires that's kicked off today has been fantastic.
That always makes me happy. And I've used this in so many ways, but it really is. I mean, if you think about kind of just follow the lineage, follow the line, and follow the history, I mean, it really helps, because then you can really see kind of end to end. And it is a cycle. I mean, they play off of each other.
Yep. So we did get a question in the Q&A from Brandy. How do you find the right people to include in your circle of feedback?
So with that, the biggest thing I try to do is I find people who don't necessarily share my opinion, don't look like me, don't share my experiences. Like, the wider you can cast your net, and particularly, okay, you have experience here. Okay, who else has experience here? And I ask, it's like, okay, I picked you. Who else should I talk to? And who am I missing? When you think through, who am I missing? And this is where, again, I mean, you may even go out on Twitter or LinkedIn and just say, hey, I'm looking for feedback on X. If you identify, as any of the following, and I've seen people do this, where it's like, I need somebody who is a veteran or who has experience here or who has knowledge of this, please come talk to me.
Fantastic.
So that's
a great
another
way
way
of
is
going out there.
crowdsource.
Oh yeah, and I think from what I've seen, doing that, especially within the Tableau data fam, is huge. And it may also bring out some things that, because we see a lot of times a strict, view of what we have in the data fam and experience, but there is more to it. And so putting out and asking that question. So thank you.
Yep.
And thank you, Brandy.
Two, I mean, putting in those feedback mechanisms of, sometimes it's like you do something and it's like you put up a Google survey where people can reply, if they have, concerns or things, particularly businesses, if they are doing something, it's like, okay, just put in a feedback form. So that way, if there is a concern or people want to, have a dialogue about it, you can pull it in. I mean, I definitely, make sure you have a tool to screen for spam.
Yep. Oh yeah, definitely.
Yes.
What other questions or comments do we have? Chat, Q&A, please let us know. But I do have to say, it's been just sitting here and walking through and seeing all the steps from beginning to end, and like, it's made you think as you went through, and seeing the then end point has been fantastic. And yes, understand the whole marketing of, and we were talking pre the webinar, her book. So, there is from that marketing.
See, there we go. I should put this up for longer than 2 seconds. And this is why I will never make any best-selling list right here, is because I am really, really bad at this. And again, this is where it's like the marketing department said, and it's like, here it is.
They're like, hey, you wrote a book.
I wrote a
So-
whole book, which is why I've got all the gray hair.
Mm.
That's what I tell people anyway.
Awesome. So any other questions, comments?
I had one. I think we have a bias consideration. What would a bias consideration like look like on a data viz?
So one thing you may say is, I did this viz on this group, but I am not a part of this group. So if I do anything on the deaf community, I would say that I originally used to work as an interpreter. I've, met people and in a lot of respects grew up around the deaf community. It's actually why I learned the language, because I kept running into deaf people. And I'm just like, okay, I've got to learn this language. But that would be one thing, is I would disclose that bias. And so, if I were to do any analysis on things like cochlear implants or anything else, that perspective is definitely a part of it, and so really going through and explaining that perspective. I've seen people where they've done, visualizations on miscarriages, and they've been very clear, this was my experience. And, I recognize how this can be for other people. And so seeing those types of both acknowledgements but also linkages to community, where you are truly telling other people who have done this, or experienced it, that, I'm coming at you from this experience. And that definitely changes the narrative.
And so
And
there's some in the chat. First, on your book, Functional Aesthetics, do you focus on Tableau visualizations, or is it visualizations just across software tools and in general?
So the bulk of the visualizations are done in Tableau, but the ideas are truly applicable across the tool. We do have some prototype tools. So Vidya Settler, who I co-wrote the book with, has things like Snowy and other things that are prototypes that she built to do various displays and things like that. So, and then a lot of the principles, it's not a how-to book. It is very much these are ideas. These are, when we think about color, there are semantic resonances among colors. So it's definitely more of a very tool agnostic book. And the demos are really there for display.
Awesome. And then as well, there's a reach out to look at guest speaking in a college class for our use. So what's the best way they can work with you on that?
Yes, let me go to the final slide again. The B Cogley without the pound sign, I don't know why it ended up with a pound sign. You can see my typos there. But bcogley@versalytics.com is really the best email to reach me at for just about anything.
Awesome. And I'm typing that into the chat right now.
And then two, I would be remiss to say, we also do things like training and mentorship and things like that. So paid engagements from Versalytics on, and I can come and do, business trainings on ethics and things like that. So we do mentorships. We do the whole consulting piece. We do talent acquisition. And then we do also have pre-made solutions that are ready to deploy.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm just going
Someday I will learn to be a salesperson, not today. Jeff will watch this and be like,
you do great already. So I did just add all of those links that you can contact Bridget on, as well as for the DataPride tug into the chat, and for both myself and Sarah individually. So just did a whole group. So if you need any of that to the chat, it's in there. Yeah. Sarah, did you have more?
Yeah, just a little bit more. So just a recap of the announcements from before, and thank you so much, Bridget, for supporting our group and sharing your time with us today. And I really appreciate you. Really appreciate the Good Place references too. So
Go read my blog then, because I've got a few of them there too.
nice.
Yes, and then
Uh,
happy to anytime. And then too, I mean, I am, don't mind recycling speakers. They can always come back and actually do a functional aesthetics talk.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, and that was a neat thing. I put this in the chat too. This was the first Tableau user group you've done this talk with. So how cool is that? I
Very.
really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So you can follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our events on Bevy. And so especially with Pride Month coming up, we'll have a lot of great things for you. So want to make sure you join us there. And also a pitch for Tableau Conference coming up May 9th to 11th. A lot of great things going on there. Lawrence will be there. I'll be there. And
Yes.
and so please say hi if you're going, and you can learn more about Tableau Conference on the Tableau website. So that's all I had for you.
Awesome. Well, just to reiterate from Sarah, thank you, Bridget. It's been absolutely fantastic, watching you, on Twitter, having you give this conversation, your book, everything. So it's been a real honor to have you here talking with us and to the Tug. And I want to thank everyone for being here and joining as well. And yes, if you are at Tableau Conference, come seek us out and more.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Awesome. Thank you all. Bye-bye.